So, section 1.1 talks about just kind of the introduction to economics and this key idea of scarcity. And so, a few goals or learning objectives for today is first that we can define scarcity and talk about how scarcity applies within economics, that we can identify then what are the factors of production and provide examples of each of those within the production of goods and services. And finally, there's three questions that all societies must ask themselves whenever they face scarcity. And so just making sure that we understand and can define those. So first and foremost, starting off, what exactly is economics? Well, again, I think kind of the easiest way to summarize economics is just to say that economics is just the social science that explores decision making, right? It focuses on the decisions that people make and how they go about their decision making process, and then how those decisions then have an influence on the world around them. And typically we see that economics is broken into kind of two branches. First of all, we have microeconomics, and then we have macroeconomics. Micro, as you know, is something small, and so we're thinking small decision making. And so microeconomics is really just the branch of economics that studies decisions made by businesses and individuals, individual businesses, individual people, individual industries. While on the other hand, macro, big, studies the decisions of that are being made by an economy as a whole or a country as a whole. And so this is the kind of stuff when you turn on the news and you see talking about unemployment and inflation and GDP, all those apply there. Now, what then exactly is the purpose of this course? Well, primarily first to understand, well, why do we have to make decisions? I think it's something that we might kind of know, but we've never really put words to. How then do we make our decisions? And then finally, what is the impact of our decisions? And today, really the focus is going to be on this first one. Why do we need to make decisions? And so why exactly do we need to make decisions? Well, at the end of the day, we have to make decisions because we want much more than we can get, right? You know, you might have heard somebody say there's only 24 hours in a day. You know, well, what does that mean? Well, it's the idea that we got so much stuff to do, but only so much time, you know, right? We have a limited amount of time, and this inability for us to be able to satisfy everything that we want or need, that's known as scarcity. And so maybe you've seen this word scarcity before, and really what scarcity just means is it means that there's a limited amount of something. Like we were talking about with your time, you might have all these different things that you want to do with your day, but your time is limited, right? And so you can't possibly do everything. Or maybe you go shopping and you have a scarce or limited amount of money. You know, you can't buy everything in the store, so you have to make decisions. And this idea that scarcity exists, it's a problem that every single person, every single society has to face. If we didn't have scarcity, if time was unlimited, if money was unlimited, you wouldn't have to make decisions. You could have everything. But the problem is we are limited, and therefore we do have to make decisions. And that problem of scarcity is what drives the economics as a social science as a whole. And so kind of for a textbook definition of economics, what exactly is economics? Well, economics is the social science that studies decisions that individuals, businesses, governments, and entire societies make as they deal with this problem of scarcity, and then the incentives that influence and reconcile those decisions. And so again, like we said, economics is really the study of decision making, but we need to make sure that we understand this relationship between scarcity and decisions, because it is scarcity, this idea that we have limited amounts of things that force us then to make decisions, right? And so we kind of got to look backwards from the decision-making thing in order to understand, well, why do we have to make decisions? And then later on, we're going to discuss, well, what is the implications or what are the consequences of making those decisions? So when we talk about this from a societal level, let's start there and talk about societies as a whole. And so maybe looking at this, as we might say, from a macro standpoint. What is it that is scarce for societies? Well, what we say is scarce for society is resources. And when we talk resources here, what we're talking about is what we might call productive resources. And so when we say productive resources, what exactly are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the resources that go into the production of goods and services. And the four of those that we're going to talk about within economics are capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor. And I always intentionally put them in this order because that's what that does is it allows us a really easy way to remember them. C-E-L-L, sell. Great. Well, let's start with maybe the one that's the easiest for us to understand or know, and that's labor, right? Labor is the resource that is the work time and the work effort that individuals put into producing stuff. It's the blood, sweat, and tears that we put into actually making things. So when, for those of you who have a job, you show up at your job, you are providing or you are selling your labor to your employer, right? You are a productive resource. Another one we look at, and we might understand the word, but not necessarily in the economic term, is land. Because land doesn't just mean we think of farmland or acreage or something like that. Land is a term that we use for all natural resources, any natural resource, these gifts of nature that exist. And I think a really easy way to think about this is these are the things that whenever we're talking about producing a product, it's the things that become an actual part of the product itself. If we're talking about building a table, it's the wood that goes into producing the table that becomes part of the table itself. Now, if you just have labor, if you just have wood, those things don't turn themselves into a table. You got to have tools in order to make the table. And that's where capital comes in. Capital are the human-made resources that we use to produce other things. So maybe it's the saw to produce the table or the drill that you use. Now, the saw and the drill, we use those to help us make the table, but they don't become part of the table themselves. So they are not land. They are not natural resources, right? They are capital. They are actual human-made resources that we then use to help us make other things. And then this final one is entrepreneurship. And maybe you've seen this word entrepreneurship, or you've seen a root of it like entrepreneur. And really, what is this? Well, what we end up seeing is an entrepreneur is somebody who takes labor, takes land, takes capital, and they can combine them in some way to produce a good or a service that they can then turn for a profit. So an entrepreneur or entrepreneurship is that ability, it's that human resource that can organize capital, land, and labor and turn it into goods and services and be able to produce those things and sell them for a profit. Now, these four together go into the production of goods and services. These four, capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor, we'll often refer to as resources, but you'll also see me interchangeably use the words maybe factors of production or inputs for these as well. Just know that those three terms all mean the same thing: resources, factors of production, and inputs. And again, easy way to remember these: CELL, sell, capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor. Now, one last thing I want to make sure we mention is that money itself is not a resource, meaning it is not a productive resource. When we talk about a table, the table is not made of $100 bills. The table is not the thing cutting the wood, right? Now, money gives us access to capital, land, labor. It gives us access to these resources, but it itself is not the resource. So just make sure that we're really careful when we're considering these productive resources. Capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor, those four actually go into the production of goods and services. And as we've sort of said before, what exactly do we use these resources for? Well, we use them to make goods and services. And really, at the end of the day, what exactly is a good or service? Well, the difference there is just that a service is some intangible action or activity. Like if somebody shovels your driveway, or if someone gives you a haircut, right? That's a service. On the other hand, a good is a physically produced tangible object. It's a thing, right? It might be the phone or the computer you're watching this on right now. It might be a car. It might be a refrigerator. Those are all goods. They're physically produced, tangible things. And then we use these goods and services in order to satisfy those wants and needs that we have. And the difference there is just that we got wants that are not necessary for survival. We have needs that are necessary for survival. However, both of those are things that people are trying to gain access to, right? People are trying to get goods and services not just to satisfy their needs, but also their wants. Now, this is where it kind of brings us full circle, because we look at this thing that okay, well, we know we have scarcity, and that leads us to decisions. And that's incredibly true when we consider these scarce resources, because we have to use these scarce resources in order to produce some limited amount of goods and services. But the problem is we're producing a limited amount of goods and services, but those limited amount of goods and services can't produce the virtually unlimited amount of wants and needs that people have, right? If we were to have a list of everybody's wants and needs, those lists will go on forever. But we don't have enough goods and services in order to satisfy everybody's wants and needs. And therefore, when we look at this on a societal level, societies have to make decisions in dealing with this scarcity. And those decisions, there's really three big ones that we look at within economics. It's, okay, well, what are we going to produce? How are we going to produce it? And then who's going to end up getting it after that? What are we producing? How are we producing? And for whom are we going to produce? And the way that societies then answer these questions or make these decisions, it determines the type of economic system that exists within that society. Whether it's a market system where those questions are being answered by the market, whether it's a command system where those questions are being answered by the government, or even somewhere in between. And we'll talk about that more at a later date, but this kind of introduces this whole idea of, well, why do we have to make decisions? Well, it's because of scarcity. When we have scarcity, when we have a limited amount of something, and we're trying to satisfy an unlimited amount of wants and needs, we have to make decisions. And later on, we're going to take a look at, well, then, faced with scarcity, how do we then make our decisions?